The first thing I noticed when I walked into the briefing hall on Station Korath was that something in the room was wrong. Not wrong in a way I could name, not a scent of blood or the particular silence that follows an ambush. It was something older than language, something coded into the deepest layer of my hindbrain, and it hit me before I had taken 3 steps past the threshold. I am Vashkari. My people are apex predators from a world of frozen tundra and iron forests. We have hunted in packs across glacial valleys for longer than most species in the galaxy have had written language. My senses are sharp enough to track a bleeding animal across 40 kilometers of snowfield. My jaws can crush bone. My reflexes operate faster than conscious thought. I tell you this not to boast. I tell you this because you need to understand what I am before you can understand how deeply it unsettled me that I could not identify the threat in that room. There were 46 cadets assembled for the first session of the Galactic Threat Assessment Academy. I counted them as I entered, the way every Vashkari counts bodies in a new space. Torvan warriors stood near the front, their massive frames taking up twice the seat space of anyone else, their bone-plated foreheads gleaming under the harsh station lighting. They were doing what Torvan always do in new environments, standing tall, letting everyone see their size, making sure no one mistook them for anything other than the most dangerous thing in the room. 3 Dreth cadets had already claimed a shadowed corner to the left, their color-shifting skin dimming to match the muted gray of the wall behind them. Ambush predators. They always found the dark spots first. A cluster of Sakari crouched together near the center, all 6 of them shoulder to shoulder, their compound eyes scanning in different directions. Pack hunters. They moved as a unit and processed threat data collectively. Standard behavior, all of it. Every predator species I had ever studied performed some version of this ritual in new environments. Establish position, assess competition, signal capability. It was so predictable, it was almost comforting. But something was pulling my attention backward. I turned and looked at the back row. There was a human sitting there, female, smaller than half the species in the room, dark hair pulled back tight, practical clothing, no visible weapons, no visible augmentation. She was reading a data pad, her eyes moving steadily across the screen, and she was doing absolutely nothing to announce her presence. No posturing, no territorial claim, no scan of the room that I could detect. She was just sitting there, quiet and contained, as if the briefing hall on a military training station was a park bench. And yet I could not look away. I forced myself to take my seat in the middle section. I sat down, placed my field kit under the bench, and tried to orient myself toward the front of the hall where the instructors would soon appear. But my head kept turning. Not sharply, not obviously, a slow drift, like a compass needle finding north. Every few seconds, without deciding to do it, I looked at the human in the back row. That is when I realized it was not just me. The Torvan, near the front, had positioned their seats so that at least one of them could see the back row without turning. The Dreth in the corner had not fully blended with the wall. Their skin patterns kept flickering, cycling through threat assessment frequencies, and every cycle oriented toward the same point. The Sakari pack was the most telling. All 6 of them had arranged their compound eyes so that at least 2 members always had the back row in their peripheral field. Every predator in the room was tracking the human. She had done nothing. She had said nothing. She was reading a data pad. I leaned toward a Vashkari cadet beside me, a younger hunter named Karath from the southern reaches. I kept my voice low. Do you feel it? Karath did not need to ask what I meant. His ears were already angled backward. I cannot stop watching her. I do not know why. Neither did I. That was the problem. The instructors entered. A Kellish elder named Vareth took the podium, his long neck swaying with the careful dignity of his species. Kellish are not predators. They are analysts, observers, scholars of conflict rather than participants in it. Vareth had spent 6 decades studying the combat doctrines of over 200 species, and his reputation was the reason most of us had applied to the academy in the first place. The first lecture was Threat Assessment Fundamentals. Vareth began with the basics, the classification of species by evolutionary combat strategy. He covered sprinters, ambush specialists, pack tacticians, venom-based subdual hunters, pressure fighters. He put each category on the display with representative species, known strengths, documented weaknesses. When he reached the generalist category, he pulled up the profile for humans. Humans, Vareth said, are classified as mid-tier generalist omnivores. Origin world is a high-gravity body, Type 7 death world designation, notable for extreme biodiversity and environmental volatility. Humans possess above-average endurance, moderate strength relative to their mass, and no specialized natural weapons. They compensate through tool use, social coordination, and environmental adaptation. He moved to the next species. That was it. Mid-tier generalists. A paragraph and a half on the display, then gone. No red flags, no special warnings. Nothing that explained why every hunter in the room was fighting the urge to keep their eyes on the back row. I looked at the human. She had not reacted to her species profile. She was still reading her datapad. But as I watched, she glanced up, not at the display, not at Vareth, but at the room itself. Her eyes moved across the assembled cadets in a slow, sweeping arc that lasted about 4 seconds. Then she went back to her datapad. I felt something cold move through my chest. I have tracked prey across the frozen wastes of my homeworld. I have watched the great hornbeasts of the northern shelf move in herds of 10,000 across the tundra, and I have studied their patterns to find the weak one, the slow one, the one the herd would not fight to protect. That 4-second sweep the human did was exactly the same thing. She was not nervous. She was not looking for the exit. She was cataloging movement, position, and formation. She was assessing the room the way I would assess a herd. That was not prey behavior. The lecture continued for another 2 hours. Vareth covered tactical frameworks, species interaction models, and the mathematical foundations of multivariable threat scoring. It was dense, rigorous material, and most cadets were fully engaged, taking notes, asking questions, occasionally challenging Vareth on fine points. The human asked no questions. She took no visible notes beyond whatever she was doing on her datapad. When the session ended, she did not move. Every other cadet stood, gathered their equipment, and filed toward the exits. The Torvan went first, as they always did, their massive bodies clearing a path through the doorway. The Dreth slipped out through side passages. The Sicarii moved as a pack, all 6 of them exiting in formation. The human waited. She sat in her seat and watched them go. Not nervously. Not with the cautious stillness of prey waiting for predators to lose interest. She watched them the way I would watch animals leaving a watering hole. She was noting who left first, who left last, who clustered together, who moved alone. She was gathering data from the act of departure itself. When the hall was nearly empty, she stood. She moved quietly, efficiently, without wasted motion. She walked to the exit, paused at the threshold for a fraction of a second, and left. I was the last one in the hall besides her, because I had been watching her watch everyone else. When she paused at the doorway, I saw her head turn just slightly, just enough to confirm that she knew exactly where I was sitting. She had known the entire time. I sat there for a long moment after she left. My heart was beating faster than it should have been. My fur was raised along my spine, the involuntary threat response that my species produces when a larger predator enters our territory. But there was no larger predator. There was a human female, maybe 60 kilograms, unarmed, unaugmented, classified as a mid-tier generalist. My body did not care about the classification. Something in me, something deeper than training, deeper than logic, deeper than the 10,000 years of civilization my people had built on top of our predator instincts, was telling me that I had just shared a room with something I was not equipped to handle. I left the briefing hall and walked to the habitat ring. The corridors of Station Korath were wide enough for Torvan, which meant they felt cavernous to me. I passed cadets from a dozen species. Some nodded, some avoided eye contact. Normal social navigation. I found Korath in the common area. He was sitting with 2 other Vashkari, and all 3 of them had the same tight energy I was feeling. Ears slightly back, posture a fraction too rigid. "The human," Korath said before I sat down. "The human," I agreed. One of the others, a female named Drenva, shook her head slowly. I asked a Dreth what he thought of her. He said he had already memorized the exits closest to her seat. He could not explain why. I sat down and stared at the table. In my entire career as a hunter, in every dangerous wilderness I had crossed, in every combat exercise I had survived, I had never encountered a creature that made me feel what that quiet woman in the back row made me feel. It was not fear exactly. Fear was what prey felt. This was something different. This was the recognition that something in my evolutionary architecture was responding to a signal I had no conscious framework to interpret. That night, I lay in my quarters and stared at the ceiling and tried to force my mind into the shape of the problem. Species classification said human, mid-tier, generalist. My eyes said small, unarmed, quiet. My training said non-threatening. Everything else, every ancient circuit in my predator brain, said watch her. Do not stop watching her. You do not yet understand what she is, but you need to know where she is at all times. I did not sleep well. The following morning, I arrived at the briefing hall early. I told myself it was because I wanted a better seat. That was a lie, and I knew it. I wanted to see where the human would sit, and whether the feeling would be the same in daylight. She arrived 6 minutes before the session began. She walked to the back row. She sat down. She opened her datapad. Every predator who was already in the room tracked her path from the doorway to her seat. Not one of them did it consciously. I watched a Torvan warrior, 300 kilograms of bone plate and muscle, shift his weight so he could see the back row more easily. He did not know he was doing it. A Dreth cadet near the wall cycled through 3 camouflage patterns in 2 seconds, which in their species is the equivalent of a stress response. A Sakari pack member clicked a warning signal to her partners, soft and almost sublingual, the kind of click they use when a large carnivore enters the hunting ground. And the human sat in the back row, silent, and read her datapad. I made a decision. I was going to find out what she was. Not what her species file said, not what the classification system claimed. I was going to understand why every apex predator on this station was treating a 60-kilogram generalist like the most dangerous thing in the room. Because our instincts were not wrong, they had kept us alive for millions of years. If every predator on Station Korath agreed on one thing, it was worth understanding why. The answer, when it came, would change everything I thought I knew about what it means to be a hunter. The practical exercises began on the 3rd day. I had spent the intervening time observing the human from a distance, gathering small data points the way a scout maps terrain before committing to a route. Her name was Noor Vasquez, and she was a cadet from the United Earth Systems Security Division. She ate alone, spoke rarely, and moved through the station with a quiet economy of motion that I found increasingly disturbing the more I studied it. She never rushed, she never hesitated. She moved at one speed, steady and measured, as if she had calculated exactly how much energy each action required, and refused to spend a single unit more than necessary. When other cadets jogged to make it to a session on time, Noor walked and arrived precisely when she needed to. When groups gathered in the common areas to socialize and establish hierarchies, Noor sat apart, watched, and said nothing. On the 3rd day, Vareth announced the first field exercise. Mixed species teams would run a simulated hostile takeover scenario. The premise was straightforward. Insurgents from a hostile faction had seized a refueling station, taken 14 crew members hostage, and fortified 3 primary choke points. Each team would be given intelligence packets and 90 minutes to develop an assault plan. The plans would be scored on tactical efficiency, hostage survival probability, and resource expenditure. Teams were assigned randomly. I looked at my roster and felt my fur rise. My team was Sorval, a Dreth ambush specialist with 12 years of field experience. Prith, a Kellish analyst who had written 3 published papers on multi-species combat doctrine, and Noor Vasquez. We gathered in a planning room, a bare metal chamber with a central holographic display and 4 workstations. Sorval entered first, his skin shifting to a neutral gray that signaled professional detachment. Prith followed, already muttering calculations about the intelligence packet. I entered third and took the station nearest the display. Noor entered last. She closed the door behind her, sat at the remaining station, and looked at each of us for approximately 2 seconds each. Then she folded her hands and waited. Protocol required introductions. Sorval went first. Sorval, Dreth Special Tactics. 12 Cycles Field Deployment. Ambush and Elimination. Prith was next. Prith. Kellish Strategic Studies. Multi-Species Threat Modeling. I straightened. Recon. Vashkari Hunter Corps. Pack Assault and Pursuit. We all looked at Noor. Noor Vasquez, she said. Nothing else. A silence stretched for 3 seconds. Sorval's skin flickered, a brief irritation response. Preth tilted his head, the Kellish equivalent of a raised eyebrow. Specialization? Sorval asked. Human, Noor said. I did not know what that meant. None of us did. But something about the way she said it made me decide not to ask again. Prith loaded the intelligence packet. The holographic display filled with schematics of the captured refueling station. 14 hostages held in the central command module. 3 choke points fortified with automated defensive turrets. The insurgent force consisted of 18 combatants, a mix of Vralkesh and Torrigan mercenaries, both sprint assault species with high burst combat capability, but documented metabolic crash windows after prolonged exertion. Sorval leaned forward, his predator brain already working. The ventilation system. I can enter through the maintenance shaft on the lower deck, neutralize the turret control node, and create an entry point in the east corridor. The east corridor is a kill box, I said, pulling up the schematic rotation. They will have positioned overlapping fields of fire. Even without the turrets, the corridor geometry favors defenders. Not if I approach from the ceiling, Sorval countered. Dreth adhesion allows vertical surface movement. I drop behind the forward position, eliminate the sentries, and the corridor opens. Their thermal sensors will detect your heat signature the moment you enter the shaft, Prith said. Dreth body temperature runs 2 degrees above ambient. In a metal ventilation channel, you will appear on their scans like a signal flare. We argued for 20 minutes. Sorval wanted to ambush. I wanted a coordinated pack rush through the West Junction. Prith calculated casualty probabilities for both approaches and found them unacceptable. It was a standard predator doctrine deadlock, each of us defaulting to the combat philosophy our species had evolved, each approach having critical vulnerabilities the others could see. Noor had not spoken. She had been looking at the intelligence packet on her workstation, not at the schematics, not at the weapon loadouts or force dispositions. She was reading something else entirely, and when she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet that all 3 of us went still to hear it. How long have they been holding the station? Prith checked. 16 standard hours since initial seizure. Noor nodded slowly. Then she asked a series of questions that none of us had considered. What is the air recycler cycle interval? Prith found it. 90-minute intervals. 4 minutes of active cycling per interval. What is the ambient temperature setting? Standard station default. 18 degrees standard. What is the lighting wavelength? Sorval's. Cold spectrum, calibrated for mixed species visibility. Sorval's skin shifted to a confused pattern. These are not combat parameters. Noor looked at him. They are the only parameters that matter. She stood and walked to the holographic display. She did not touch the force disposition overlay or the weapon placement schematic. She pulled up the environmental systems readout and studied it for 30 seconds. Then she began to explain. 16 hours without a sleep rotation. The Vralkesh and Torrigan mercenaries were sprint assault species. Their combat metabolism was optimized for short, explosive engagements. After 12 hours of sustained alertness, their reaction times would have degraded by roughly 15%. After 18 hours, cognitive function would begin to fragment. After 24 hours, they would be operating on neurochemical fumes. The air recycler produced a 4-minute noise burst every 90 minutes. During that burst, ambient sound levels in the station increased by 22 decibels, more than enough to mask a careful approach through adjacent corridors. The ambient temperature of 18 degrees was comfortable for humans and most generalist species. It was 4 degrees below the metabolic comfort zone of Vralkesh, whose homeworld averaged 26 degrees. After 16 hours in a mildly cold environment, their muscle response would be measurably slower. Not dramatically, just enough. The cold spectrum lighting was designed for alertness, but it also suppressed melatonin-equivalent hormones in 6 of the 10 most common predator species. The insurgents had not changed the lighting because they did not understand its effect. It was keeping them in a state of artificial alertness that would accelerate their metabolic crash when it came. Noor pointed to a specific moment on the environmental system's timeline. In 42 minutes, the air recycler would begin its next 4-minute cycle. Simultaneously, the station's automated maintenance system would perform a routine lighting diagnostic that would cause a 3-second flicker in the east corridor. And the temperature, which had been slowly dropping by a fraction of a degree per hour, as the station's thermal management compensated for the increased body heat of the occupying force, would hit its lowest point of the cycle. 3 factors converging: noise cover, a visual disruption, and a thermal low point. A 90-second window where the insurgents would be at their most degraded and most distracted. "We do not attack their strength," Noor said. "We attack their biology." We entered during the recycler burst through the West Junction. Rickon leads the approach, using the noise cover for the pack rush. Sorval enters through the upper maintenance shaft during the lighting diagnostic, when thermal sensors will briefly recalibrate. Prith coordinates from here, feeding us real-time environmental data. We do not engage until the 90-second window opens, and we finish before it closes. Silence. Sorval stared at her. I could see his skin cycling through 3 different emotional states: surprise, reassessment, something that looked uncomfortably close to what Dreth feel when they encounter a predator larger than themselves. "You are not planning to overpower them," he said quietly. "No," Noor said. "You are planning to wait until their bodies fail them." "Yes." Prith ran the numbers. Casualty probability dropped by 68% compared to any of our original approaches. Hostage survival probability jumped to 94%. Resource expenditure fell to minimal. We executed Noor's plan. Every element worked exactly as she predicted. The recycler burst covered our approach. The lighting diagnostic created the precise confusion she anticipated. The Vralkesh mercenaries were sluggish, slow to react. Their sprint assault instincts dulled by hours of cold and sleeplessness. They did not even recognize as degradation. We achieved the highest score in the exercise by a margin that Prith later described as statistically unprecedented. When the results were announced to the full cadet body, our team's approach was held up as a model of innovative tactical thinking. Noor did not react to the announcement. She made some notes on her datapad and returned to her seat in the back row. That evening I found Sorval in the common area. The Dreth was sitting alone, which was unusual for a species that typically sought isolated spaces only when processing something deeply unsettling. His skin was a flat, matte gray, the Dreth equivalent of a troubled frown. "I have been a hunter for 40 cycles," he said without looking at me. "I have tracked and killed creatures on 9 worlds. I have eliminated targets that other operatives refuse to engage." He paused. His skin flickered. "That human does not hunt the way we hunt. We look for the moment of strength. The perfect strike, the instant of maximum advantage." He turned his head, and for the first time, I saw genuine unease in a Dreth's body language. She looks for the moment of collapse. She does not find the strongest point and attack it. She maps every weakness and waits for them to intersect. I sat down across from him. "It is effective. It is terrifying," Sorval said, "because it means she was never worried about the enemy's weapons, numbers, or positions. She was only ever worried about time. How much time until they fell apart on their own. We were the tools she used to fill the window. But she created the window by doing nothing, by waiting." I thought about that for a long time after he left. In the following days, I began asking other Predator cadets, carefully, indirectly, whether they had noticed anything unusual about the human. Every single one of them admitted the same thing. They tracked her, constantly, involuntarily. They could not stop, and none of them could explain why. A Torvan warrior named Gren told me he had rearranged his entire morning routine so that he always knew which corridor Noor would be in. Not to avoid her, not to confront her, just to know. A Sakari pack leader named Chith said her entire pack oriented toward Noor whenever she entered a room, even when they were in the middle of tactical planning. It was disruptive, and they could not override it. Something about this human was triggering a response that transcended species boundaries, cultural context, and conscious control. Every predator on Station Korath was running the same involuntary program, and the program said one thing: track her, know where she is. Do not lose sight of her. You do not yet understand why, but you cannot afford to stop watching. And Noor sat in the back row, silent, and read her datapad, and gave no indication that she knew, or cared, that every apex predator on the station was watching her, like she was the most dangerous thing in the room. But she knew. I was certain of it. She had always known. 3 weeks into the academy, something shifted. Not in the cadets, and not in the training program. It shifted in me. I stopped being able to pretend that my fascination with Noor Vasquez was simply professional curiosity. It was something deeper, something that pulled at the oldest architecture of my brain, and I needed to understand it, or it was going to consume me. The academy continued at its relentless pace. We ran scenario after scenario, each one more complex than the last. Multi-front engagements, asymmetric warfare simulations, hostage extraction under degraded conditions, defensive holdouts against superior numbers. In every exercise, the same pattern emerged. The predator species cadets performed brilliantly in the opening phase, when raw combat instinct and physical superiority mattered most. But as scenarios extended past the 6-hour mark, as complexity accumulated and conditions deteriorated, a different kind of intelligence began to dominate. Noor's kind. She never led loudly. She never gave orders with the commanding bark of a Torvan or the sharp hiss of a Dreth. She simply offered observations in that quiet, measured voice, and people listened because her observations were always right. Not approximately right. Precisely, exactly, devastatingly right. She predicted enemy movements based on biological stress cycles. She calculated the exact moment when an opposing force's cohesion would begin to fracture. She identified weaknesses that no one else could see, because they were not weaknesses of strength or position, they were weaknesses of time. By the 4th week, Vareth had begun using Noor's tactical frameworks in his lectures, without naming their source. The concepts were too effective to ignore. Time-indexed threat degradation, metabolic window exploitation, environmental attrition mapping, terms that did not exist in any galactic military doctrine before a quiet human cadet introduced them through practice exercises. But the lecture that changed everything came on a gray morning in the 5th week. Vareth entered the briefing hall with a data archive under his arm and a particular tightness in his posture that I had learned to associate with material he considered deeply significant. He activated the holographic display and brought up a star chart centered on a station I had never heard of. "Today we study the fall of Carax's station," Vareth said. "It is one of the most remarkable defensive engagements in galactic military history, and it is one of the least studied. I intend to correct that." The display filled with tactical data. Carax's station was a research outpost in the Vareth Corridor, a region of space contested by 3 major factions during the Second Expansion conflict. The station had been targeted by a combined hostile force of over 2,000 combatants, drawn from 4 sprint assault species. The attacking force had overwhelming numerical superiority, superior firepower, and complete control of the surrounding space. The station had been defended by 14 operatives. Murmurs rippled through the hall. I heard the Torvan cadets shifting, already trying to calculate what species could field 14 warriors capable of holding against 2,000. The Dreth were perfectly still, which meant they were intensely focused. The Sakari pack was clicking at frequencies too high for most species to hear. "Which species?" Gren asked, the Torvan's deep voice carrying easily across the hall. Vareth let the question hang for a moment. Then he changed the display. 14 human faces appeared on the screen. The briefing hall went silent. Not the respectful silence of attention. The stunned silence of a room full of predators confronting something they cannot reconcile with their understanding of the universe. 14 humans held Carax's station for 11 standard months, against a besieging force of 2,116 combatants, Vareth said. They did not hold it through superior firepower. They did not hold it through biological dominance. They held it through a doctrine that, until I studied this engagement, I did not know existed. He brought up the tactical timeline. The humans had not fought a conventional defense. They had not established fortified positions and repelled assaults. Instead, They had done something that, as Vareth walked us through it, made my blood run progressively colder. They had turned the station into a trap. Not a trap that killed, a trap that eroded. First, they modified the station's environmental systems. Temperature dropped by 1 degree every 72 hours, so gradually that the besieging forces never noticed the change consciously, but their metabolisms noticed. Cold-blooded and warm-blooded species alike began burning more calories to maintain core temperature. Ration consumption increased. Energy reserves depleted. Second, they altered the lighting cycles. Human circadian rhythms are remarkably resilient. They can adapt to irregular light patterns and maintain cognitive function under conditions that would drive most species into severe disorientation. The humans set the station lights to a random interval cycle that was tolerable for human biology, but devastating for the enemy's sleep architecture. Within 3 weeks, the besieging forces were experiencing chronic sleep deprivation without understanding its source. Third, they made noise. Random, unpredictable, varying noise. Banging on bulkheads, broadcasting fragments of human music at odd hours, activating maintenance alarms at 3 in the morning. Nothing dangerous, nothing tactically significant in isolation, but the cumulative effect was relentless psychological pressure. The enemy could never fully rest, never fully relax, never reach the deep recovery state that their combat biology required. Fourth, they set traps that did not aim to eliminate. The humans rigged corridors with devices that caused pain, but not lethal injury. Stumbling hazards that twisted ankles. Pressure-activated mechanisms that delivered sharp bursts of sensation to the feet. Adhesive compounds that stuck to skin and took hours to remove. Every trap was designed to slow, frustrate, demoralize, and injure just enough to reduce combat effectiveness, without provoking the kind of fury that might drive the enemy into a full-scale suicidal assault. Fifth, and most disturbingly, they rotated sleep in shifts that their enemies could not match. Human sleep is modular. Humans can function on fragmented rest cycles, sleeping for 90 minutes, operating for 6 hours, sleeping for 90 more. No other species in the attacking force could do this. The humans were always awake, always watching, always present. Every time the enemy sent a patrol into the station, they encountered humans who were alert, calm, and ready. Every time the enemy tried to rest, they heard noises, felt temperature changes, found new traps. They left messages. Small notes in the enemy's language, placed where patrols would find them. The messages were simple. We are still here. We are not tired. How long can you keep this up? 11 months. 14 humans held a station against 2,000 combatants for 11 months, and when the conflict ended, the besieging force withdrew. Not because they were defeated in battle, because they could not endure the humans any longer. Their forces were riddled with sleep deprivation injuries, metabolic dysfunction, and a profound, grinding psychological deterioration that their military psychologists later classified as a new category of combat fatigue. The humans suffered injuries. They suffered exhaustion. They suffered in ways that would have broken most species. But they did not stop. They adapted. They rotated. They endured. And they kept going. The record showed one more detail that Vareth saved for last. After 11 months, when the besieging force finally withdrew, the 14 humans walked out of Carax's station under their own power. All 14. Not a single one had been lost. They were thin, scarred, and exhausted beyond any medical standard that applied to their species. 3 of them had injuries that should have required evacuation months earlier, but they had kept functioning. They had treated their own wounds, managed their own pain, and continued operating because stopping was not something their biology permitted as an option. The medical teams that examined them afterward found something remarkable. The humans had lost weight, gained stress fractures, and accumulated a catalog of injuries that would have hospitalized members of any other species for months. But their cognitive function was intact. Their tactical awareness was undiminished. 11 months of siege warfare had ground their bodies down to bone and sinew, and their minds were still sharp. The lead medical officer's report contained a single observation that I have never forgotten. The human body appears to be designed for precisely this kind of sustained operational degradation. Their physiology does not optimize for peak performance. It optimizes for continued function under conditions of progressive deterioration. They are not built to win quickly, they are built to not lose slowly. The briefing hall was absolutely silent when Vareth finished. 46 cadets from a dozen predator and analyst species sat in their seats and processed what they had just heard. Vareth looked at the room. The doctrine employed at Caraxus has no equivalent in any other species' military tradition. Human military historians call it persistence doctrine. It is not about winning the fight. It is about outlasting the fighter. He paused. I want you to consider what that means. Every combat doctrine you have studied, every tactical framework in your training, is built on the assumption that conflict is resolved through decisive action. A strike, an ambush, an overwhelming assault. Persistence doctrine does not seek a decisive moment. It seeks the absence of one. It removes the enemy's ability to force a conclusion and then simply continues until the enemy cannot. Gren, the Torvan warrior, spoke into the silence. His voice was unusually subdued. They won by refusing to lose. Vareth nodded. That is precisely correct. I looked at Noor. She was sitting in the back row, her datapad dark, her hands still. She was looking at the display, but her expression held no surprise, no revelation, no shock. She had known all of it, before she set foot on this station. Caraxus was not a lesson for her. It was her heritage. The lecture ended. Cadets filed out in near total silence. The usual post-session arguments and discussions were absent. Something fundamental had shifted in the room, a recalibration of assumptions so deep that it would take days to process. I waited. Noor waited. When the hall was empty except for the two of us, I stood and walked to the back row. She looked up at me. Her eyes were brown, steady, and patient. There was no aggression in them, no challenge, no dominance display. There was simply a calm, focused awareness that made my fur rise along my spine. I need to ask you something, I said. I know what you want to ask, she said. Then answer it. Why do we watch you, every predator on this station? We cannot stop. We track you the moment you enter a room. We monitor your position when you walk the corridors. We orient toward you without choosing to. I have never experienced anything like it, and I have faced creatures that could swallow me whole. Noor considered the question. Not briefly, not dismissively. She gave it the genuine weight of someone who had thought about the answer for a long time. How does your species hunt? She asked. Coordinated pack assault. We pursue prey until we reach optimal strike distance. Then we attack from multiple vectors simultaneously. Short pursuit, decisive engagement. How long does the pursuit last? Rarely more than a few minutes. We are sprinters. Explosive speed over short distances. Noor nodded. Most predator species are some version of that. Sprint, ambush, or overwhelming force. You are built for the burst. The moment of maximum output. You hit hard and fast, and if the prey survives the first strike, many predators will abandon the chase. Yes, the energy expenditure of a prolonged pursuit is not efficient. Noor leaned back in her seat. On Earth, humans were not the fastest animal. We were not the strongest. We had no claws, no venom, no armor, no camouflage. On paper, we should have been prey, and for millions of years, we were. Everything on our planet was faster, stronger, and more lethal than us. She paused. Her voice was quiet, almost conversational, but I felt the weight of what she was about to say, pressing against my chest like a gravitational anomaly. So we evolved a different strategy. We did not learn to sprint. We learned to never stop. Persistence hunting. We would pick a target and follow it. Not fast, not aggressively, just steadily. The prey would sprint away, and we would walk after it. The prey would rest, hear us coming, and sprint again. We would keep walking. The prey would run until its body overheated, until its muscles filled with toxins, until its legs failed. And then we would be there. Still walking, still coming, still breathing. I stared at her. My mouth was dry. Your instincts are not wrong, Recon, she said. Every predator species in the galaxy evolved defenses against other predators. Bigger teeth, faster reflexes, better camouflage, thicker armor. You are all prepared for something that attacks in a burst, that commits everything to one explosive moment. Your biology knows how to deal with that. She looked at me, and I saw something ancient in her eyes. Not threatening. Worse. Patient. Nothing in your evolution prepared you for something that just follows, that never speeds up, that never tires, that is simply always there, a little bit closer than it was an hour ago. You track me, because your hindbrain recognizes what I am, even though your conscious mind cannot classify it. You are not detecting a rival predator. You are detecting a pursuit pattern that nothing in your evolutionary history has equipped you to counter. She smiled slightly. It was not a cruel smile. It was almost gentle. You watch me because your instincts are screaming that if you look away, I will still be there when you look back. And you are right. I will be. I could not speak for a long time. When I finally found words, they came out rough, stripped of the formal register I normally used with non-Vashkari. You are telling me that your species became the dominant life form on your planet by being the thing that never stops following. Yes. And the fear that every predator on this station feels when they look at you is the same fear that every animal on your planet felt for 2 million years. The recognition, yes, not the fear itself. You are not my prey, Rykon, but the signal your hindbrain is receiving is the same one. Something is following you, and it will not stop. I left the briefing hall that afternoon with a new understanding of the universe and a cold feeling in my chest that has not entirely faded since. But the conversation with Noor was not the only thing that happened that day. Earlier that week, I had noticed irregularities in the station's supply shipments. Minor inconsistencies, a delayed cargo shuttle here, a rerouted communication there. Nothing that would alarm a typical cadet. But I had been trained to track patterns, and the patterns were wrong. That evening, Noor found me in the corridor outside my quarters. She appeared so quietly that I startled, which is extremely difficult to do to a Vashkari. You have noticed the supply disruptions, she said. It was not a question. Yes, something is interfering with the station's logistics chain. It is not interference. It is interdiction. Someone is selectively disrupting our resupply to isolate the station. She handed me her datapad. The screen showed a pattern analysis I had not seen before. A time series mapping of every delayed shipment, every rerouted communication, every anomalous signal burst in the surrounding sector. The pattern was clear. Station Korath was being cut off. Slowly, methodically, precisely. The way a human would do it. Vralkesh, Noor said. A raiding fleet. Based on the interdiction pattern and the signal burst frequencies, I estimate they will reach weapons range within 72 hours. I felt my combat instincts ignite. The instructors, have they been informed? The instructors have not recognized the pattern. They are analysts. They study conflict in the abstract. They are not watching for the approach of a predator. But you are. I have been watching since day 4. She took the datapad back. I have memorized the station schematics, including the sections not covered in our training materials. I have mapped every environmental control access point, every emergency bulkhead, every corridor junction with tactical significance. I have reviewed the biological profiles of Vralkesh raiders, sprint assault physiology, maximum combat engagement window of approximately 6 hours before metabolic crash. She looked at me, and in her eyes I saw Caraxis. I saw 11 months of patience and relentless, grinding, unbreakable endurance. I saw a species that had spent 2 million years learning that the only thing that matters in a fight is who is still standing at the end. When the burst predators come, she said, will you trust me? I looked at this small, quiet, unarmed human female, and every ancient instinct in my body answered for me. Yes. She nodded. Good. Start learning the bulkhead codes for sections 9 through 14. We are going to need them. I did not sleep that night either, but this time, it was not because I was afraid. It was because I was preparing. Because the Vralkesh were coming, and they had no idea what was waiting for them. They came at the worst possible hour. The Vralkesh hit Station Korath at the deep cycle mark, when the station lighting was at its dimmest, and half the cadets were in their sleep rotation. A beautiful piece of tactical timing for a sprint assault species. Come in fast, come in hard, overwhelm the defenders before they can organize. It was the kind of attack that had broken 100 stations across 3 sectors. The first sign was the lights going out. Not dimming, not flickering, going dead black, all at once, across every section of the station. Emergency lighting kicked in 3 seconds later, bathing everything in a deep red glow that turned the corridors into arteries. The second sign was the sound, a deep, resonant vibration that shuddered through the hull as Vralkesh breaching pods clamped onto the station's outer ring and began cutting through the armored plating. I counted the vibrations, 5 attachment points, 5 breach teams. Conservative estimate of 20 to 30 combatants per pod. We were looking at somewhere between 100 and 150 Vralkesh raiders. The third sign was silence. Communications went dead, jamming. Broad spectrum, powerful enough to blank every frequency the station used. We were cut off from the outside and from each other. I was on my feet before the emergency lighting finished cycling. My quarters were on the 4th level of the habitat ring, close to the emergency stairwell that connected to the main corridor junction. I grabbed my field kit, a training weapon that had been upgraded to live fire status 3 days ago, when Noor quietly convinced Vareth that a live fire exercise was overdue, and I moved. The corridors were chaos. Cadets from a dozen species stumbled out of their quarters in various states of readiness. The Torvan were fastest to mobilize, their massive bodies already moving toward the sounds of the breach with the instinctive fury of territorial predators. The Dreth vanished, their camouflage engaging instantly, pulling them into the shadows like smoke. The Sakari clustered, their compound eyes reflecting the red emergency lights in thousands of tiny crimson points. The prey species froze. Kellish analysts stood in doorways, their long necks rigid with fear. Prolori cadets curled into defensive spheres, their hardened outer plates snapping shut. Drell herbivores stampeded toward the interior of the station, their herd instincts overriding every bit of training. It was a mess. It was exactly the kind of chaos that sprint assault raiders exploit, hit hard enough to shatter cohesion, then hunt the fragments. I rounded the corner to the main junction, and Noor was already there. She was standing in the center of the corridor intersection, feet planted, arms at her sides. She was wearing the same practical clothing she always wore, her dark hair pulled back, her expression so calm that it looked carved from stone. Around her, a dozen cadets from different species milled and shouted and tried to organize. She did not shout. She did not bark orders. She spoke in a clear, steady voice that cut through the noise like a blade through water. Recon, take every Vashkari you can find and hold the junction at Section 9. Do not engage. Hold position, and report what you see. I moved without thinking. Her voice had a quality I had never heard before, not commanding in the way of a Torvan war chief, or sharp in the way of a Dreth assassin. It was the voice of absolute certainty. She knew what was happening. She knew what needed to happen next. And in a corridor full of panicking predators and fleeing prey, she was the only person in the building who was not running on instinct. She was running on something else. Something colder, something with a longer time horizon than instinct could imagine. I gathered Karoth, Drenva, and 2 other Vashkari and moved toward Section 9. Behind me, I heard Noor continuing to direct cadets with that same quiet precision. She sent the Sakari packs to Section 12, where their collective sensory processing could cover a wide corridor network. She directed the Dreth to disappear into the ventilation system and serve as invisible scouts. She pulled the Kellish analysts into a secondary control room and set them to work hacking into the station's environmental systems. She did not tell anyone to attack. She did not set up a defensive line. She organized a retreat. And it was the most brilliant tactical decision I have ever witnessed. I understood it, the moment I saw the Vralkesh breach the outer ring. They came through the hull breaches like a flood, armored bodies pouring into corridors, weapons firing, voices roaring in their guttural assault language. They were magnificent in their fury, fast, coordinated, brutal. A Vralkesh breach team at full power is one of the most devastating combat units in the galaxy, and these were fresh, rested, fully supplied, and operating at peak metabolic output. If we had tried to hold a defensive line, they would have smashed through it in minutes. If we had tried to match their aggression with our own predator instincts, the Torvan Fury and the Dreth ambushes and the Vashkari pack assaults, we would have spent our strength in the first hour and had nothing left for the second. That was what the Vralkesh expected. That was what they had planned for. Meet the enemy's strength with greater strength. Classic sprint assault doctrine. Noor refused to play that game. She pulled us back, section by section, and let the Vralkesh chase ghosts through empty corridors. Every section they seized cost them time and energy and gave them nothing of value. Every sealed bulkhead forced a detour. Every empty room was a question mark. Where were the defenders? What was the trap? Where would the counterattack come from? The answer was nowhere. The counterattack was not coming. Not yet. Not for a very long time. And that absence, that refusal to engage, was the weapon itself. Because Noor was not defending the station. She was preparing to take it back. By the time the first Vralkesh breach teams pushed into the station interior, Noor had cadets positioned across 6 sections. Not to fight, to observe, report, and fall back. Every time a Vralkesh squad advanced, they found empty corridors, sealed bulkheads, silence. The Vralkesh pushed deeper. They were fast, disciplined, and savage. Their combat physiology was everything I expected from a sprint assault species: explosive speed, devastating close-range capability, neural architecture optimized for rapid threat assessment and elimination. In the first hour, they swept through the outer ring and began penetrating toward the station core. And then things began to change. The temperature dropped, not dramatically, not enough for the Vralkesh to consciously register the shift. 1 degree, 2. A subtle, crawling cold that Noor had ordered the Kellish analysts to implement through the environmental controls. Vralkesh homeworld average temperature was 27 degrees. In station ambient was already below their comfort zone. Every additional degree below that cost them reaction speed and metabolic efficiency. The lights changed. The emergency red was replaced by a cycling pattern that Noor had specified in precise detail. 3 seconds of red, 2 seconds of darkness, 5 seconds of blue-white, 1 second of darkness. A pattern with no rhythm, no predictability. A pattern designed to prevent the Vralkesh visual cortex from adapting. The noise started, random, intermittent, coming from everywhere and nowhere, banging on bulkheads 3 corridors away, a high-pitched whine from the ventilation system, a voice, sometimes Noor's, sometimes a recording, speaking calmly in Vralkesh trade dialect. Section 4 is clear. Section 7 is clear. We are still here. I watched from Section 9, as Vralkesh advance squads began to slow. Not because they encountered resistance, because they encountered nothing. Empty corridors that should have been defended, sealed bulkheads that forced them to detour through longer routes. Environmental conditions that nibbled at their combat edge 0.1% at a time. Noor was turning Station Korath into a persistence hunting ground. She was not fighting the Vralkesh, she was wearing them down. Hour 3. A Vralkesh squad breached into Section 11 and ran into a Sakari ambush. The Sakari pack hit them from 3 directions, fought for exactly 90 seconds, then vanished through pre-planned escape routes. 3 Vralkesh down, no Sakari casualties. The squad regrouped and pushed forward, but they were rattled. They had expected a terrified, disorganized enemy. They had found something else. Hour 4. Dreth scouts reported that the Vralkesh advance was losing cohesion. Squads that had entered the station as disciplined units were spreading out, covering more ground, moving more cautiously. They were chasing shadows. Every time they cleared a section, they heard noise from a section they had already cleared. Every time they established a position, the temperature dropped another fraction. The lighting cycle changed again. Hour 5. Noor took a wound. A Vralkesh flanking team cut through a maintenance corridor and caught her team in a cross-corridor intersection. The fighting was brutal and close. I was not there, but Karoth was, and he told me what he saw. Noor took a projectile fragment in her left shoulder. The impact spun her sideways and drove her into the corridor wall. She bled. She staggered, And then she straightened, pressed her hand against the wound, and continued directing the retreat, as if the injury was a minor inconvenience. She did not stop, Karoth told me later. His voice was shaking. She was bleeding, and she did not stop. She looked at the wound, she estimated the severity, and she adjusted her plan to account for reduced mobility in her left arm. In the middle of combat, while bleeding. That was the moment, I think, that the Predator cadets stopped being unsettled by Noor and started being something else entirely. Something closer to awe. Because they recognized what they were seeing. A Torvan fights through injury with rage. A Dreth fights through injury with cold discipline. A Vashkari fights through injury with pack fury. Noor fought through injury with mathematics. She calculated the new parameters, adjusted the variables, and continued operating. Her biology did not demand a berserker response or a tactical withdrawal. It allowed her to absorb damage, update her model, and keep functioning. It was not bravery in any sense that Predator species understood. It was something more fundamental, more mechanical, more relentless. Hour 6. I was at the Section 9 junction when I heard Noor's voice on the emergency intercom, steady and clear despite the wound. All units. This is Vasquez. The 6-hour mark has passed. Vralkesh metabolic crash begins now. Hold positions. Do not engage. Do not pursue. Let them feel the cold. Let them hear the noise. Let them wonder where we are. She was right. 6 hours was the threshold. Everything she had told me about sprint assault physiology was playing out in real time. The Vralkesh had come in fast and hard, burning through their combat reserves at a ferocious rate. Now the bill was coming due. Their reaction times were dropping. Their coordination was fragmenting. The cold, the noise, the disorienting lighting, and the utter absence of a conventional enemy to fight were grinding them down. I stood in Section 9 and listened to the station around me. In the distance, I could hear Vralkesh squads calling to each other, their voices carrying the ragged edge of fatigue. I heard bulkheads cycling as they tried to chase scouts who had already vanished. I heard the ambient noise generators producing their random symphony of bangs and whines and whispers. And underneath all of it, like a heartbeat, I heard the steady, quiet rhythm of a human woman who had been awake for 32 hours, was bleeding from a wound in her shoulder, and had not stopped thinking for a single second since the attack began. The long night had begun, and the Vralkesh had no idea what was coming. Hour 8. The Vralkesh commander attempted to consolidate his forces near the station's central hub. It was the right move for a sprint assault force. Pull back to a defensible position, rest, resupply, and launch a fresh assault. But Noor had anticipated it. Every route to the central hub passed through corridors that the Kellish analysts had rigged with environmental traps, temperature fluctuations that alternated between chilling cold and uncomfortable heat, lighting that strobed at frequencies calculated to induce nausea in Vralkesh visual processing, sounds that mimicked Vralkesh distress calls, generated from recordings the Dreth scouts had captured during the fighting and played back on a randomized loop. The consolidation failed. Squads got lost. Communications between Vralkesh units were degraded by the jamming, which Prith had partially reverse-engineered and turned back against the attackers. Units that should have reached the hub in 20 minutes took 90. By the time they arrived, they were exhausted, disoriented, and jumping at every shadow. Hour 10. I led a Vashkari patrol through Section 6 on Noor's orders. Our job was not to engage. Our job was to be seen. We moved through the corridor at a steady pace, making no effort to hide, letting our claws click against the metal decking, letting the Vralkesh patrols hear us coming. Then we turned a corner and vanished through a pre-planned route that Noor had mapped during her weeks of quiet study. The Vralkesh squad that had been tracking us arrived at the corner and found an empty corridor. No enemy, no fight, just silence and cold, and the distant sound of something banging on a bulkhead 3 sections away. This was persistence doctrine in action. Do not fight the enemy. Be near the enemy. Be constant. Be inescapable. Never give them a target to engage, but never give them a moment of peace. Let their bodies do the work of defeating them. Hour 12. I found Noor in the secondary control room. Her shoulder wound had been field dressed by a Kellish medic, and the bandage was spotted with blood. She was standing at the environmental systems console, reviewing data scrolling across 3 screens simultaneously. She had not slept. She had not sat down in over 14 hours. She looked tired, not broken, not desperate. Tired the way a distance runner looks at the midpoint of a race, deep in the effort, but nowhere near the limit. "How much longer?" I asked. She pulled up a tracking display. Red dots showed Vralkesh positions throughout the station, data compiled from Dreth scout reports and Sakari sensor analysis. The dots were clustered, scattered, moving in erratic patterns that bore no resemblance to the disciplined assault formations of 12 hours ago. "Their commander is losing control," Noor said. "Individual squads are making independent decisions. 3 units have retreated to their breach pods and are refusing to re-enter the station. 2 more are lost in the ventilation network. The core assault force has approximately 45 effective combatants remaining, and their metabolic indicators suggest they have been awake for over 20 hours. Can we push them now?" "Not yet." She touched a control and changed the ambient temperature by another ½ degree. "Let them feel it a little longer. Every hour we wait costs us nothing and costs them everything." I stood there and watched her work. This woman who had sat in the back row for 5 weeks, silent and patient and watchful. This woman who had seen the attack coming 10 days before anyone else because she was always watching, always tracking, always measuring the distance between her and whatever was approaching. She was not stronger than the Vralkesh. She was not faster, she was not more heavily armed. She was simply still here, still functioning, still thinking, and they were falling apart. Hour 14. Noor sent small teams to hit isolated Vralkesh positions. 2 cadets, sometimes 3, striking from unexpected angles, engaging for 60 seconds, then withdrawing. Never enough to force a full engagement. Just enough to keep the pressure on. Just enough to ensure that no Vralkesh raider anywhere on the station could close their eyes without wondering if something was coming. The pattern was deliberate. Noor staggered the raids at irregular intervals, sometimes 30 minutes between contacts, sometimes 90, sometimes 2 raids within 5 minutes of each other in different sections of the station. The Vralkesh could not predict when the next strike would come or where it would land. Their threat alert systems stayed locked at maximum, flooding their bloodstreams with combat hormones that their exhausted bodies could no longer process efficiently. They were burning through their reserves just by being afraid. Sorval led a raid into Section 7 and reported back with something close to amazement in his flat Dreth voice. The Vralkesh he encountered were flinching at their own shadows. One raider fired at a maintenance drone that had been cycling on its automated path for 30 hours. Another tried to engage a Dreth scout and missed every shot from a distance of 4 meters, his hands shaking so badly that the weapon wavered across a 30-degree arc. I led one of these raids myself. We hit a 4-raider squad that had barricaded themselves in a storage bay. The Vralkesh were sitting against the walls, their weapons across their knees, their eyes hollow with exhaustion. When we appeared in the doorway, 2 of them tried to raise their weapons, and one of them actually fell asleep in the 3 seconds it took us to enter the room. We subdued them without significant resistance. As I secured the last one, I looked into his eyes and saw something I recognized. Not rage, not defiance, despair. The bone-deep, marrow-grinding despair of a creature that has been pursued past the point of endurance and knows, with absolute certainty, that the pursuit will not stop. It was the look that prey gets on my homeworld when the pack has run them for too long and their legs begin to shake. I had seen it 1,000 times. I had never expected to see it in the eyes of a Vralkesh raider. Hour 18. The Vralkesh commander made contact. A burst transmission on the emergency frequency that Prith had left open for exactly this purpose. The commander's voice was raw, stripped of the arrogant precision that Vralkesh officers were known for. He demanded surrender. Ours. Noor took the communication. She sat in the secondary control room with her wounded shoulder and her blood-stained bandage and her steady, quiet voice, and she responded. She listed the number of his remaining effective combatants. She listed their positions, accurate to the corridor junction. She listed the estimated sleep deprivation level of each unit, the ambient temperature in each section they occupied, and the caloric deficit they had accumulated since the attack began. Then she said, "You can withdraw your forces to your breach pods and leave this station, or you can remain and discover what happens at hour 24. The commander did not respond immediately. When he did, he demanded to know how many defenders the station had. "Enough," Noor said. He did not believe her. He pushed his remaining forces into one final coordinated assault on the secondary control room. It was a desperate, exhausted, clumsy attack, driven by pride and fury, rather than tactical logic. Exactly the kind of attack that sprint assault species default to when their cognitive function is degraded and their discipline has eroded. I could hear them coming before I saw them. The sound of Vralkesh boots on metal decking had changed over the course of the night. At hour 1, it had been sharp and rhythmic, the precise footfalls of trained combatants moving in formation. Now it was ragged, uneven, the stumbling cadence of bodies being driven forward by willpower alone. Noor tracked their approach on the environmental sensors. She called out positions with the same calm precision she had maintained all night, adjusting deployments, shifting teams, opening and closing bulkheads to channel the assault into corridors that maximized our advantages and minimized theirs. She was playing the station like an instrument, and every note was calculated to drain one more fraction of strength from the attackers. Hour 20. Noor repositioned assets. The Sakari packs covered the approaches. The Dreth set ambushes at 3 key junctions. The Vashkari, my people, formed the mobile response teams, ready to hit any breakthrough point. The Vralkesh came. They were fast, even now. Even exhausted, even cold, even sleep-deprived to the point of hallucination. A Vralkesh raider is a terrifying combatant. They moved through the corridors with the desperate fury of a trapped predator, and for 20 minutes, the fighting was the most intense I have ever experienced. I fought a Vralkesh squad leader in a corridor junction near Section 11. He was bigger than me, faster in his prime, and armed with a close combat weapon that could have split my skull with a clean strike. But his prime had been 18 hours ago. His swings were wide, slow by Vralkesh standards, and his footwork was that of a fighter operating on muscle memory because his conscious mind could no longer keep up. I dodged twice, closed the distance, and brought him down. He lay on the deck, breathing in ragged gasps, and his eyes did not track me. They stared at the ceiling with the vacant exhaustion of a body that had been pushed past every design limit it was built with. But 20 minutes was all they had. 20 minutes of maximum effort combat, and then the metabolic crash hit like a wall. Vralkesh raiders collapsed in corridors. Weapons dropped from shaking hands. Targeting systems that relied on neural input failed, as exhausted brains could no longer provide clean signals. Hour 22. Noor gave the final order. All units, push, now. The predators went in. Torvan warriors smashed through weakened barricades. Dreth assassins materialized behind disoriented defenders. Sakari packs swept corridors in tight, lethal formations. And the Vashkari ran. We ran the way our ancestors ran across the frozen tundra, fast and fierce and together. And for the first time in this long nightmare, we were the ones on the attack. But we were not the ones who won this fight. We were the teeth, but Noor was the jaw. She had positioned every piece. She had created every advantage. She had spent 18 hours turning the station into a machine that consumed the enemy's strength 1 degree, 1 decibel, 1 sleepless hour at a time. We were simply the final mechanism, the closing action, the moment when patience became impact. The Vralkesh broke, not all at once, in pieces, squad by squad, corridor by corridor. They surrendered, collapsed, or retreated to their breach pods. The commander was found in the central hub, sitting on the floor, his weapon beside him, staring at nothing. He did not resist when the Torvan cadets secured him. Hour 26. A galactic relief fleet dropped out of transit space and deployed assault shuttles to retake the station. They came in expecting a battlefield. They found the station intact, the cadets alive, and 112 Vralkesh raiders in custody. The relief marines who boarded the station moved through the corridors in tactical formation, weapons raised, expecting ambushes around every corner. What they found instead was a strange, quiet aftermath. Vralkesh raiders sitting in clusters under cadet guard, their heads down, their weapons stacked neatly against walls. Some of them were sleeping where they sat, their bodies finally surrendering to the exhaustion that Noor had spent 22 hours cultivating. Others stared at nothing with the hollow eyes of creatures who had been broken not by violence but by time. One of the relief marines, a Kellish sergeant, stopped in a corridor and looked at the environmental readout on her scanner. Temperature was 8 degrees below standard. The lighting was cycling in the disorienting pattern Noor had programmed. Ambient noise generators were still producing random sounds at irregular intervals. "What happened to this station?" she asked. Karath, who was escorting her team through Section 6, gave her a one-word answer. "Humans." The relief fleet commander, a Torvan admiral named Bren, came aboard personally. He walked through the corridors that still bore the marks of the fighting, the scorch marks on the walls, the sealed bulkheads, the environmental systems, still running Noor's modified settings. He reviewed the tactical data. He interviewed cadets from 6 different species. He pulled up the engagement timeline and stared at it for a long time, tracing the slow, methodical degradation of the Vralkesh force with one thick finger. Then he asked who had led the defense. When they told him it was a human cadet, not an instructor, not a graduated operative, a first-year cadet who had not yet completed the academy program, Bren stood in the corridor for a long time without speaking. He was a Torvan, a species that prides itself on never showing uncertainty. But I saw his jaw tighten and his eyes narrow, and I recognized the expression because I had worn it myself 5 weeks ago when I first sat in a briefing hall and could not stop watching the woman in the back row. The debrief lasted 2 days. Military analysts from 4 species dissected every decision Noor had made, every environmental modification, every tactical deployment. They mapped the engagement timeline against Vralkesh metabolic data and confirmed that her predictions had been accurate to within a margin of error so small that Prith called it statistically indistinguishable from prescience. Commendations were issued. The Academy Commandant gave a speech about interspecies cooperation and the value of diverse tactical perspectives. Admirals and generals sat in the front row and nodded gravely. Noor sat through all of it with the same quiet composure she had worn since the first day. She accepted the commendation. She answered questions with precise, concise responses. She did not dramatize. She did not embellish. She reported facts the way she always did, as if they were self-evident, as if anyone paying attention would have seen the same things she saw. When the debrief ended, and the admirals departed, and the station returned to something resembling normal operations, Noor walked back to the briefing hall. She walked at the same steady pace she always used, the pace that wasted no energy and covered ground without urgency. She entered the hall, walked to the back row, sat down, and opened her datapad. I followed her. I stood at the end of her row for a moment, watching her settle back into the posture I had come to know so well over the past weeks. Quiet, contained, patient, the posture of something that has no need to announce itself, because it is always exactly where it needs to be. I sat down next to her, not across the room, not at a safe observational distance, next to her. She looked up from her datapad. For the first time since I had met her, she made direct, sustained eye contact with me. Her brown eyes were steady and warm, and held a depth of experience that I was only beginning to understand. She smiled, small, brief, a barely perceptible curve of the lips that lasted perhaps 2 seconds. And in that smile, I saw everything. I saw the savannas of Earth, vast and golden and burning under a merciless sun. I saw the first humans, small and fragile, and outnumbered by everything that wanted to consume them. I saw them stand up on 2 legs and look at the horizon and begin to walk, not run, walk, toward the prey that had just sprinted away from them in a burst of panicked speed. Walk toward the predator that had just tried to ambush them and missed. Walk toward whatever the world threw at them, one step at a time, steady and relentless and fundamentally, terrifyingly patient. I saw a species that had looked at a universe full of things that were faster and stronger and deadlier and had said, simply and quietly, "We will still be here when you are not." "Thank you," I said. She nodded. Then she looked back at her datapad, and I sat beside her in comfortable silence, and for the first time, the instinct to track her did not feel like a warning. It felt like respect. I have thought about that time often in the years since Korath. I have graduated from the academy. I have served in 3 campaigns and advised 2 planetary defense councils. I am considered one of the most capable threat assessment specialists in the Vashkari military, and I have earned that reputation through hard work and sacrifice. But everything I know about true tactical thinking, I learned from a woman who sat in the back row and said almost nothing. Noor Vasquez went on to a career I can only describe in terms that fail to capture its scope. She designed defensive doctrines for 17 allied species. She advised the Galactic Security Council during the Thresh incursion and the Korvathi border crisis. She never raised her voice. She never demanded recognition. She simply showed up, assessed the situation with those patient brown eyes, and began the slow, methodical work of turning every disadvantage into an asset and every enemy strength into a liability. She retired 11 years after Korath. The retirement ceremony was attended by military leaders from 32 species. Gren, the Torvan warrior, traveled 14 days to be there. Sorval came out of deep cover for the first time in 6 years. Chith brought her entire Sikari pack. I was there. I sat in the front row, and when Noor walked to the podium, I watched every predator in the room do the same thing they had done on the first day of the academy. They tracked her. Not consciously, not deliberately. Every head turned, every eye followed, every predator instinct in that packed ceremonial hall oriented toward a single, small human female as she walked calmly to the front of the room. She noticed. She always noticed. And she smiled, that same small, brief smile. After the ceremony, a young Dreth officer approached me. He was fresh from the academy, eager and sharp and twitching with the barely contained energy of a predator species in its prime. "Commander Rykon," he said, "I have read your tactical assessments. Your work on cross-species threat modeling is required reading at the academy now." "Thank you. I have a question, if you will permit it. In your published analysis of the Korath defense, you described the human operative as the most effective tactical mind you have ever encountered. You ranked her above Torvan war masters and Dreth assassination specialists. With respect, Commander, how is that possible? Humans are mid-tier generalists. Their species profile indicates no exceptional combat capabilities." I looked at this young predator, so confident in his classification systems and species profiles, and I remembered being exactly where he was standing. I remembered looking at a datapad and reading the words mid-tier generalist and thinking I understood what a human was. "Walk with me," I said. We walked through the corridors of the station where the ceremony was being held. Through wide windows, the stars burned cold and distant. I took my time. I chose my words carefully. "You are a Dreth," I said. "Your species hunts through ambush. You find the perfect position. You wait for the perfect moment, and you strike with maximum lethality. If the strike fails, you reposition and try again. Correct?" "Correct." The Torvan overwhelm through force. The Sikari coordinate through collective intelligence. The Vashkari pursue in packs at high speed over short distances. Every predator species in the galaxy is built around the same fundamental assumption: that conflict is resolved through a decisive moment, a strike, a pounce, an overwhelming assault. Yes, that is the nature of predation. Humans do not have a decisive moment. They do not strike. They do not pounce. They do not overwhelm. What they do is something that no other species in the galaxy evolved to counter. They persist. They absorb damage and keep functioning. They endure conditions that would break any other species and simply adapt. They track a problem the way their ancestors tracked prey on the African plains, not by sprinting after it, but by following it at a steady pace until it collapses from exhaustion. I stopped and looked out the window at the stars. Every predator species watches humans, every one. We cannot help it. Our instincts recognize something in them that our conscious minds struggle to classify. It is not the recognition of a rival predator. It is something older, something more fundamental. It is the recognition of a pursuit pattern that our evolution has no answer for. The young Dreth was quiet. I could see his skin cycling through processing patterns, the Dreth equivalent of deep thought. You asked how a mid-tier generalist can be the most effective tactical mind I have ever encountered, I said. The answer is that the classification is wrong. Humans are not mid-tier. They are not generalists. They are something the galaxy has never seen before. They are endurance predators. They are the species that learn to win by never stopping. And every other predator in the galaxy, no matter how fast, how strong, how lethal, has the same instinctive response when they encounter one. What response? I smiled, and it was not a comfortable smile. The overwhelming need to know where the human is at all times, because somewhere in the deepest, oldest part of your brain, you understand that if you lose track of them, they will still be there when you turn around. A little closer than before, a little more patient, a little more prepared. I turned from the window and looked at the young officer. You want to know why I ranked Noor Vasquez above Torvan War Masters and Dreth Specialists? Because War Masters and Specialists win battles. Humans win everything that comes after the battle. They win the long game. They win the war of time. And time is the one resource that no predator, no matter how powerful, can defeat. The young Dreth left. I stood at the window for a while longer, thinking about a briefing hall on Station Korath, and a woman who sat in the back row and read her datapad, while every predator in the room fought the ancient, irresistible urge to keep her in their sight. We track her because we must. Every predator instinct we carry recognizes what she is. Not a rival, not prey, something our evolution never prepared us for. She is patient, she is relentless, she is human, and she will never, ever stop. I learned one more thing from Noor Vasquez. One thing that matters more than all the tactical doctrine and threat assessment frameworks combined. A week after the ceremony, I received a message on my personal channel. It was from Noor. It was short. Rickon. New Academy class starts tomorrow. 48 cadets, 7 predator species. I am told there is a human in the intake group. A young woman from the colony, on Verath 3. She will sit in the back row. She will be quiet, and within 20 minutes, every predator in the hall will be watching her. Please make sure they understand what they are feeling. It will save them a great deal of confusion. I smiled. I sent my reply. I will. Thank you for everything. Her response was the last message I received from her. 3 words that encapsulated everything Noor Vasquez was, everything her species was, and everything the galaxy was still learning about the quiet, patient, relentless creatures from a high-gravity death world who had walked out of the savannas and into the stars. Still here, Rickon. And somewhere, on a planet or a station or a ship crossing the void between stars, I know she is. Still there, still watching, still patient. Because that is what humans do. They endure, they persist, they remain. And the galaxy, whether it knows it yet or not, will never stop watching them. Because you always want to know where the endurance hunter is sitting.